Okay, I'll kick us off and we'll just get into a conversation. So Dana, thank you for coming and joining us for our annual Justice Weekend. We take one weekend a year around Dr. Martin Luther King Day to, as a church family, think about issues of justice in our world. And our faith should not just be something we do in private, but it should also be something that has public impact. God came to transform the world. And one of the things that happens in the book of Genesis is actually a fair amount of sexual violence. And it happens in several different chapters, several different ways. We're aware of your work in sexual violence issues in our community, and that it actually happens around us. Sometimes, I know myself, I'm not really aware of it. It's something that happens behind, closed houses and so forth. But we want to learn from what you do with your work and how we can get involved as a church and understand the connections between the value system we're learning in the scriptures about who God is and how God sees human beings. And how that actually applies in our setting today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So a couple questions. Let's just start by, I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you got into this arena of law enforcement, caring about human trafficking. How did that begin for you?
Well, this week is my 25th anniversary with the Contra Costa DA's office.
Congratulations.
I joke that I started when I was 12. It actually was the first job that I had out of law school, and I decided that I wanted to be a prosecutor while I was in law school when I learned that being a prosecutor meant that my job was always to do justice. And all lawyers are supposed to do what their clients want to do. I get to work for the people of the state of California. I'm not hired by an individual, so I represent the people. And the people always want to see that justice is served. And that means that I'm always required to do the right thing. So this is a really exciting avenue for me to have these conversations with you and with your congregation, because what we're doing as prosecutors is doing the right thing. I grew up in Contra Costa County. I'm raising my kids here. So I've spent my whole life here. I'm intentionally with the DA's office for my entire career because it gave me a chance to make a difference that I can see. I remember being in college and being pressured to save the whales with Greenpeace. And I never got to meet a single whale that I saved. But I have met families and I have seen the impact that we've been able to have in doing this work. One of the approaches that we take at the Contra Costa DA's office is the collaborative approach. And that goes back decades with Contra Costa County. We have, as an initiative of our board of supervisors, the Alliance to End Abuse, which is an intentionally diverse, multidisciplinary group of stakeholders that come together from various county departments and agencies to have a meaningful impact on interpersonal violence in our community. And we look at 5 domains of interpersonal violence: domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And we've been human trafficking for a while. It started with domestic violence. In fact, this initiative initially was called the Zero Tolerance Program for Domestic Violence, and then it expanded to include all of these different domains of interpersonal violence. And I saw when I was in your restroom that you have the resource cards that include the Family Justice Center.
That we do.
So the Alliance is what helped give birth to the Family Justice Center.
Okay.
And I became part of the Alliance when I went into management with our office, and I began to supervise our domestic violence prosecution team. And in working with this intentionally diverse group of stakeholders, I became familiar with Susan Kim, who's the executive director of our Family Justice Center, that got its start in Richmond. Then we spread to a second location in Concord, and significant here, we just recently opened a third location in Antioch. And I get to say we, because I've been on their board of directors since they left the support of the board of supervisors and became a standalone nonprofit organization. So I'm currently the vice chair of their board of directors. And I serve in my capacity as a citizen of Contra Costa County, representing South Contra Costa County, where we live. And I'm influenced by my work with the DA's office, but mostly I represent normal people who live and work, and families who live and work in Contra Costa County. And so our office was an applicant for a federal grant in October of 2018. And the grant is called the Enhanced Collaboration Model to Combat Human Trafficking Grant. And the idea is that we build a task force which intentionally enhances collaborative efforts among law enforcement partners and victim advocacy partners. And that's kind of like trying to mix oil and water. There's a lot of siloing that goes on in what the responses are to interpersonal violence. Advocacy organizations sometimes resent the invasion or the intrusion of law enforcement and the criminal justice system into matters of interpersonal violence, where it might be that not everybody wants us there. But since we're representing the entire community, we take the perspective, the approach that when violence occurs to any member of our community, it affects the entire community. And we're looking in cases of involving interpersonal violence, family violence, not at breaking up families or ending relationships, but taking violence out of the equation. And I was really energized by the collaborative approach that we were able to take with the Family Justice Center, which is a co-located victim service center. And we started co-locating prosecutors at the Family Justice Center in Richmond. We still have a prosecutor who works out of the Family Justice Center in Richmond full-time. I co-locate at Antioch when I'm able to. We've had prosecutors that work out of our Concord office. And we also co-locate law enforcement resources there. And when we built those partnerships with the advocacy partners, we made a better and more sustainable and longer lasting impact. When the opportunity came to apply for this grant, the Alliance became the applicant on the victim service side, and we worked with 5 different victim service providers. And then the District Attorney's Office became the applicant on the law enforcement side. Contra Costa is a little different than some of the other areas in California. There's 7 of us that have this grant, where there's one giant advocacy partner and one giant law enforcement agency. Los Angeles is a great example. Their sheriff's department is massive, and they had a huge victim service partner. And so enhancing the collaboration between those 2 partners wasn't as challenging. In Contra Costa, we have 26 different law enforcement agencies. So Brentwood PD may have no clue what's happening in the community right next door, which is Oakley, which is actually a contract city with our sheriff's department. They certainly aren't going to know what's happening in Richmond, California, the other side. Contra Costa is really regional. Over here at the east end of Highway 4, folks know that if you have to go up and over that hill, there better be a good reason. Nobody wants to go over the hill. It's one of the reasons
the hill we're on right now?
Yes. It's a beautiful hill. You have a lovely view of the bay from here. But if you're in Brentwood and you need to go get help and you have to go all the way over Highway 4 to Concord and then come back in that traffic, you're not going to go, which is why we moved to Family Justice Center to Antioch, telling families they could go to Concord to get help. They weren't coming. And so we've seen that regionalized approach even with law enforcement agencies, victim service agencies. We tend to have things that happen in East County, things that happen in West County. We forget that South County exists sometimes altogether. We forget about Highway 24, and that's still part of Contra Costa County. So looking at how we serve the county as a whole has been particularly challenging.
So let me ask a more basic question. Can you describe what you mean by human trafficking and how that is, where's the boundaries between that and other types of behavior that might be destructive, but from a legal perspective, how do you define human trafficking, and can you give us a sense of how much it happens around here? Does it happen around here?
Sure. So we look at state law and federal law, which are 2 similar but different definitions of human trafficking. And they're important to understand because the United States Attorney's Office prosecutes federal crimes. They might be things that happen in Contra Costa County. I only prosecute things that violate California law, and I'm jurisdictionally bound by what happens in Contra Costa.
Which is more restrictive, or which has a broader definition of human trafficking, federal or state law?
Federal law that deals with human trafficking touches on more things that we don't worry about here in Contra Costa County under state law. For example, but they're all similar in that what we're looking at is the conduct of depriving someone of their personal liberty. We shorthand it as liberty deprivation. And that conduct is done with the intent to commit other forms of crime. The 2 basic types of human trafficking are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Under California law, which is my specialty, because I'm a state prosecutor here in Contra, Costa County, we're looking at sex trafficking as being defined as depriving someone of their liberty with the intent to commit another sex offense. The most common ones that we see are to force a person or to facilitate a person entering into commercial sex work, or to profit from the commercial sex work of another person. Those two crimes are the crimes of pimping and pandering. We have maybe a TV notion of what a pimp is. Somebody with a purple hat with a big feather in it, or there's a lot of rap culture that glorifies pimping. But the reality is the crime of pimping is just knowingly deriving any support or maintenance from the commercial sex work of another person. So when we talk to people that are being pimped, they don't know they're being pimped. The guy that drives you to your dates and then you do the date for money and then you give him all the money, you don't think he's your pimp, but under California law, he is. The person that helps you, that supports you, I've had in listening to wiretaps or jail calls that we're allowed to listen to, we're listening to the conversations of people that are involved. They think of themselves in a management role. So you're the talent, and I'm managing you. I'm like your manager. And of course, if I was the talent manager and you were a recording artist, you would pay me for that.
Right.
Well, the management that person is doing of a commercial sex worker is facilitating their commercial sex work. That's the crime in California of pandering. And it might be getting that person dates or advertising for them online or driving them to locations, serving as their security, because it's a very dangerous thing for typically women to get involved with. They're guilty of a crime called pandering. Getting money in exchange for doing that work. It's not being a manager. It's not a job or an opportunity, a career choice. It's a crime in California. And now you're guilty of pimping. Where there's liberty deprivation involved in that conduct, it crosses a line from being pimping and pandering to also becoming sex trafficking.
I see.
If children are involved, it's different. It's much broader because all over, across many different aspects of childhood, we legislate that kids need to be kids, that kids don't have the capacity to, for example, enter into contracts. Kids all want cell phones, but if they went into AT&T and tried to buy one and sign that contract, we would tell the adult on the other side of the counter, you lose. Kids can't sign contracts. Kids want to buy cars. We know that they can't buy cars. Any contract that a child signs, that child isn't going to be bound by, because we don't think children have the ability to make those important decisions. I'm the mother of high school seniors. They know more about current events than I do. But until they turned 18, they couldn't vote. They also couldn't join the military. We've just decided that there's that hard line where you don't have the life experience to be bound by these really important decisions. And engaging in sex is one of them. So children can't be prostitutes. They can't make that decision. Legally, we've made that course correction. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. And that means that if an adult encourages a child or induces a child to engage in commercial sex, the sex trafficking law in California encompasses that conduct. That is a violation of one of the subsections because we are protecting children from being manipulated into this.
So give me a sense of like where the majority of victims in the sex trafficking world come from. Are they primarily minors, or are they primarily not full adults, or I would imagine they come from already vulnerable backgrounds? Like how do they get into this?
Our victims are hiding in plain sight. They're everywhere. It could be the person sitting next to you on the bus. It could be the person sitting next to you in church right now as a person who's had an experience of being pressured or induced to engage in commercial sex. There's a tremendous amount of glamorizing that occurs in popular media. We're seeing commercial sex work, sex trafficking occur within boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, that you're going to do this to support us. And the belief that I'm consenting, I've decided that I'm going to pay the rent by selling sex and you're going to do your job, this is going to be my job. that bubble bursts when, in the cases that I've seen that become trafficking, when the victim says, I'm done, I'm tired, I want to stop, and the greed sets in, and you're not going to stop till I tell you you can stop. I've seen victims, domestic violence plays a role. A lot of our cases first show up as domestic violence because the victim can talk about how he hurt me. She can talk about, and it's almost she and almost always he. They can talk about the violence that occurred, and you can see the black eye. You can see the fingerprint marks from the strangulation that occurs.
Yeah.
So the force and violence, you're going to keep making money until I say that you're going to stop. But the shame is what stops our victims from telling the whole truth.
Wow. How, for people who are listening and for myself too, how could we identify people, if these people are hiding in plain sight and people that we know, but that we're unaware of this dimension of their life? Do you have any tips or suggestions for us about how to be keyed into that so that we can be helpful?
One of the things that we're asking our law enforcement partners to start doing when we're looking at domestic violence survivors or even our medical service providers is ask safety questions. And to let survivors know that this is a safe place. Nobody's judging you. There's a tremendous amount of social stigma against engaging in commercial sex work. A belief that if you're doing that, then you get what you deserve, or you deserve what you get. Right. And so a lot of our victims struggle with, if I tell you what I'm really doing, you're not going to help me. And we're trying to project a lack of judgment. And we're trying to work actively, affirmatively on projecting care, concern, and compassion. And so the same could be said for our congregation. When we're talking to schools about sex trafficking, we're seeing a huge amount of recruitment occurring of juveniles over social media.
Yeah, talk about this. Talk about the role of internet and also the new domain of virtual reality and the way that is going to be sexed in profound ways.
So when the pandemic hit us and we told kids to be on the computer all the time because we're having virtual school now, we stopped paying attention as much as we should have as parents to what they're doing when they're online. My boys have their phones up like this all the time. We've stopped maybe being as vigilant as we should in finding out, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? One of my law enforcement partners has an undercover social media account. And so we've learned a lot about how, in posing as a young, troubled female, how the undercover officer is being recruited. Oh, you need money, you need help, come do this, I'll take care of you. And it's a very simple recipe of vulnerabilities being identified and exploited, promises being made to induce that person to, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to love you, you only need to do this one thing. And then one thing becomes 10 things. One of the things that we've seen is in inducing young people to start engaging in commercial sex work for the first time. The thing that keeps them going is the threat, I will tell your mother. If your mother knew you were a prostitute, if your mother knew you were nothing but a fill in the blank, and that terrifies the child victims or the young adult victims that we've worked with. I didn't know how to get out. I couldn't stop because if I didn't do what, in this case, it was a female exploiter, if I didn't do what she said, she was going to tell my mom. She had pictures. She was going to show my mom. So we're talking to kids about the phenomenon that kids are so afraid of being judged by their peers, by their parents, that what if a friend comes to you with a secret and pressures you that the way that I need you to be my friend is to keep this terrible secret. I did a bad thing. Are you being, and another teenager or young person never having had this experience, what a burden to have to keep on your own. Are you being a good friend to keep that secret? Or is the better thing to do is to encourage your troubled friend that we need to find an adult, a trusted adult, and we need to share the secret. We need to get help. And so your congregation can project out to our youth, we are those trusted adults. We will help. We won't judge. And we're never going to stop loving and caring about you.
Amen to that. You know, as a pastor, as I hear you saying this, I'm just thinking about the levels of human motivation behind all these types of behaviors, or what's going on in the world of people who do this. And I mean, the category by which we approach this is the concept of sin, the idea that like there is a deep a brokenness, a proclivity towards using others and dehumanizing others and doing things that are ultimately for our own self-aggrandizement through a variety of channels and degrees of indirectness.
The group of people that become our traffickers there's a common denominator that runs through all of my defendants, and it's greed. And it's this belief that I can commodify, so we refer to commoditization or commodifying this human as something I can sell. So I'm going to profit from another human being. And then the mental gymnastics that occur in justifying that. Well, she wanted to do this. She consented. It was her choice. Or younger people, the vernacular is she was with it. She was down for this. I never forced anybody to do anything. And that's why the statute has a very broad definition of what constitutes liberty deprivation. It's when a person feels that they're not free to make their own choices. And one of the questions that we ask our victims to really explore that, because if I ask a victim, did he force you? She's going to say no. Or he's going to say, no, I was never forced because nobody put a gun to your head. Right. So we have a really narrow definition of what force is. Yeah. This is manipulation and exploitation. This is somebody who is outgoing, charismatic, who can figure out what this person needs more than anything and offers it. Sometimes what that thing is love. Right. So if you have love nowhere but the person who is exploiting you, and one of the tools of exploitation is that love, they give it and they pull it away. They give it and they pull it away. One of the tools that we have in building criminal cases is cell phones, text messages. The case that I was in court on today, I'm looking at over 9,000 text messages between my victim and her exploiter. She doesn't believe she was forced. But when I read these text messages and I have an expert detective with my police agency that's highlighting the messages that show the manipulation. When you look at over time, if she doesn't do what he's telling her to do, he threatens to end the relationship. And her vulnerability is that need for love. And that's one of many things that occurs. And another is the pimping subculture. There are literally considered to be rules. It's referred to as the game. And part of the rules is the person engaged in the commercial sex work gives all of the proceeds to that person that acts in the pimp or the manager or the exploiter role. And then that person, in order to have the basic necessities of life met, needs to go to the exploiter and ask for money, for food, shelter. We see text messages, can I see my mom? Can I see my child? No, not until you do. And not always is violence a necessary ingredient. Sometimes it occurs, but not always. It's the manipulation and the false promises. One of the things that constitutes liberty deprivation under our statute is fraud. What if you promise somebody something? If you do this, then you can have what you need. An image that I like to use, I think it's in one of my slides, is the image of the donkey with the carrot with the stick. The donkey doesn't want to pull the cart, but he keeps doing it because what he really wants is that carrot. And the donkey believes if I just keep walking forward, pulling this cart, I'm going to get what it is that I need. That occurs at so many different levels of identifying that thing that you need. I'm going to promise it to you, and then I'll keep pulling it back if you just need to keep going.
How many of the victims come from abroad? You know, I think when I go down to the Port of Oakland and I see all these big boxes and stuff, and I'm wondering, are there human beings in there? And are there?
So when you ask me kind of what are the differences between the state and the federal laws, one of the things that's encompassed in federal statutes against human trafficking is this concept of human smuggling. Then there's this belief that somehow we need to move people in order to have them trafficked.
Right.
And under California law, there's no movement of people.
It's because we think of traffic as the thing out on the highway.
Exactly. But if we deal with narcotics trafficking, that's
Right.
just drug dealing, the sales of a commodity. So really trafficking deals with the commodification of something that is illegal to sell. So we've moved from selling guns to selling drugs to now selling people.
Yeah.
It might involve smuggling. I might have a person who's moved to a location where he or she does not want to be moved to. It might involve holding that person against their will. Those are separate crimes. They're not necessarily required to form part of human trafficking.
How many prosecutions in a county like Contra Costa County, how many annual prosecutions of sex trafficking are there?
Well, there's two of us in my unit. Nichelle Holmes has primary responsibility for our sex trafficking caseload. I supervise the prosecution unit, and I handle labor trafficking, which is an evolving area of law. So we're just beginning to build that. We have one labor trafficking case. It actually came from Brentwood. And it went at our last meeting. We're struggling with Nichelle having this enormous caseload. So she, as an individual prosecutor, has more than 20 cases in her caseload. They're
At
all
any
really
time or for a
right now.
year?
She's got 20 cases right now.
Yeah.
So I've started taking back some of the sex trafficking cases. The pandemic did not slow us down. What we saw as a result of the pandemic
the other
was
way.
economic insecurity.
Yeah.
Forced people into what we call illicit economies.
Yep.
And so we have people who never would have thought that they would do this before,
Yep.
feeling like they need to sell sex in order to put food on the table.
Right.
So that's why we're not, the Contra Costa DA's office is not interested at all in prosecuting people who are engaged in prostitution. We're looking for the people behind prostitution who are exploiting or manipulating them into that work.
Interesting. You know, the context for us biblically for this conversation is in Genesis chapter 19. There's this scene where there's this sort of like gang that wants to rape, and Lot, who's a character in the book of Genesis, says, "Here, take my two daughters." And he kind of throws them out. And as we read this, for me, it never even occurred to me to be like, I can't believe those daughters did that. It's like, how could Lot do that? It's abhorrent. And so it gets to that distinction that you're just making, which is to say, like, it's actually the people who are running the whole racket behind the scene who are really doing the crime, as opposed to the victims doing this.
Exactly, and this was an evolution. I've been with the DA's office for 25 years. When I started, we prosecuted the commercial sex workers under our prostitution statute. We would get complaints that they were out there standing on that corner and we didn't want to look at them, so go arrest them and make them go away. And what we ended up doing, we learned when we started collaborating with advocacy partners, was more harm than good. So if we want people to come out of commercial sex work,
let's talk about that. I'm curious what the pathway out is.
Tagging them with convictions is going to make it so that they can't get a different kind of job.
Exactly.
And without a good paying job, how are you going to get an apartment in Contra Costa County or anywhere in California?
Exactly.
And so what we've started doing as a state, which is really exciting, it started with looking at some ways to change how things are criminalized. So there's no such thing as a child prostitute. That was a legislative change a few years ago. We now recognize that for a survivor of human trafficking to have an off-ramp from that life when she's ready for that, she needs to be able to clear her criminal record. So how do we do that? So we've created a system, a statutory system, where if there were arrests or convictions that occurred when a person was being trafficked, that were the direct result of them having been victims of human trafficking, they can petition the court to have that record wiped clean. And in Contra Costa County, all of those petitions will go to my unit because we know what the human trafficking, we know what it is. So we know how to recognize it. So, and we've decided that we need to have that consistency as an office. So if I'm representing these folks as my victims, and I need a jury to understand why they behave the way they behave, because they are victims of trafficking. They're being manipulated, they're being exploited. How can I then go across the hall and say, oh, but that person's going to get prosecuted here? So we will help those victims in clearing their records so that they can escape from this life. Effective January of 2022, the legislature has given us a mandate in the criminal justice system that if you are a victim of human trafficking, it is a defense to everything except violent crimes. So sometimes what we're seeing is our victims become exploiters because they're trying to rise out of victimhood. It seems to be a little bit like the kid that got bullied.
Right.
It becomes a bully as a way of wanting to distance from that.
I remember reading that many of the exploiters themselves have a background in abuse, where they've been abused, and it's generational in a way that's really
a lot of
tragic.
times what we've learned from, and I resolved a case this way when I met with a defense expert. Our victim was a survivor herself of child rape, right. And she was branded as being nothing but a prostitute, and so she figured she may as well just be one. And she began to validate herself as a commodity because she was so beautiful, she was being told by her initial exploiter, that she equated to her value in terms of how much money she could make. Right. And then the trappings of that wealth, right. Fancy purses and shoes and hair and nails, right. And that made her feel validated. And then she transitioned. She didn't want to be the assistant pimp. She wanted to become the pimp. Yeah. For her, she saw it as rising up in the organization. Right. And she recruited 3 girls from another state to come here and exploited them horribly.
Are these organizations in the formal sense of, obviously not registered with for tax purposes, but is there a sort of a managerial team?
We see that sometimes.
Really?
And in this one case that I was talking about, what we learned, it was her unresolved trauma that propelled her into this. And she, as a young person, developed or failed to develop empathy. And right. and that case resolved in having her work with a sexual violence therapist as a way of reducing the harms that she caused. Right. Are there organizations? Yes. Are there some that are formal? They're harder for us to penetrate. Massage parlors often are controlled by larger criminal organizations, and there are language barriers for us in penetrating right. Some of those organizations, and those are things that we're trying to learn better to do by working with advocacy and other law enforcement partners. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, to use the massage parlor example, if there were a worker from Asia at a massage parlor, and there was a sting operation, say at the massage parlor or something, are the actual masseuses, are they in trouble or no?
Those are the people that we're looking at as victims.
Right. That's right.
We've taken that, we've adopted that approach countywide through the Human Trafficking Task Force. We're not interested in prosecuting people involved in commercial sex work because we understand the degree of manipulation and exploitation. Right. Yeah. And we've also learned by working with our advocacy partners that there's a cycle that a lot of our victims are going through, and we've been told we need to meet them where they are in that cycle. Mm-hmm. They may not be ready to disclose. They may not be ready to accept services and support. And so our advocacy partners are giving them the message that we will be here when you are ready. They can't be ready on my time or their time. So
you can't forcibly extract people from this? If you become aware of this, if someone's not willing to be helped, you cannot help them. Is that essentially right?
The same way you can't do it. As a pastor,
right.
Where you see one of your parishioners struggling and you can see the path out, right. But until that person is ready to accept right. the hand up,
right.
all you can do is say that, I value you and I care about you and respect your human dignity, and yeah. I will be here when you are ready.
Yeah.
I was really excited to learn about 6 months after a prosecution when I had an angry 19-year-old victim who cursed me up and down in court in front of the judge on the record, and was very angry, and that the anger and that expression of anger was a product of her trauma. About 6 months later, she reached out to the advocate and said, I'm now ready. You said you would still be here. And the advocate was able to help her leave a really bad home situation, move into an entire different county, help her get a job, and start the steps toward leaving the life. But it had to be when this young woman was ready and able to accept that help.
there's a lot of analogs there to the spiritual life, just in general. Moments when God's sort of like, all right, you do you, take your time. But yeah, there's a more full life available for you when you're ready.
When you're ready, right. And the only thing that I can do is take the exploitation out of the equation. It was very similar to when I was supervising a domestic violence unit. I'm not the relationship police.
Right.
If you want to reconcile with the abusive partner,
Right.
that's your choice. My job is to take violence out of the equation, and there's different ways that we can do that, including forced accountability for that, and that's what a criminal prosecution is.
But how can you regulate emotional violence? Or, it gets complex pretty quickly, no?
It does, and a lot of what we're seeing is a very narrow definition of what constitutes trafficking or illegal exploitation, and a need for awareness raising to occur. One of the things, we do a tremendous amount of school outreach, and we decided that we needed not just to teach young women not to become victims, but we needed to teach young men not to become defendants.
Yeah.
And one of the cases that I prosecuted, young man that had very strong community support. His conduct required him to serve a minimum of 3 years in state prison. He'd never been arrested or convicted of anything like this before. And so he went from 0 to 60 pretty darn quickly.
Yeah.
And we've been learning about principles of restorative justice. And so DA Becton has given us permission in appropriate cases to experiment with applying some of these principles in cases where I could throw the book at this young man and send him to prison and turn my back.
Yeah.
Or we could say, in appropriate cases, what are the alternatives to incarceration? How can you change?
Yeah.
These principles of restorative justice, how can you show me that you understand that you've caused harm to this community, and what are you going to do to heal that harm? And this was an experiment. I asked this young man to write a 500-word essay.
Really?
And I told his lawyer, like, the difference between him and you, I'm going to know if you wrote it. Right? He's going to sound like a young man in his early 20s versus somebody who went to law school. So I'm going to know if it was you. And he was on home detention. And so that counts as actual incarceration time. So he admitted, and I wanted accountability, right? You need to admit, you need to own that what you did was wrong. So he pled guilty to the crime of pimping his girlfriend. And with the court's consent, we didn't have him sentenced that day. So the sentence for state prison didn't mean he was booked into jail and put on a bus to San Quentin.
Right.
He stayed at home on his ankle monitor, with a bunch of restrictions on, here are the places you can't go. You can't go to the street corner in Richmond where you took your girlfriend to sell her for sex. And we'll know if you go there. And you have to write this essay that demonstrates that you've learned. And the theme of the essay was explain how supporting and profiting from the commercial sex work of others harms women in communities. And you have to do some community service work. And as luck would have it, he had a family member that was a pastor. And that it was a congregation that had a soup kitchen. And he started working in the soup kitchen, and then became involved in youth ministry. And he was a success story.
Yeah, that warms my heart to hear some success stories on both sides of the equation.
He wrote the paper.
Right.
And the judge in this case was a former public defender who started the same time I did. So this judge and I had tried cases against each other. When I
Who won usually? We don't have to go there.
But when this judge heard me say, because the judge has to agree with any negotiated plea agreement, and if the judge doesn't like it, then it doesn't go forward. So the defense attorney and I agreed, the defendant agreed, the victim agreed, and I needed the judge to agree. When this judge heard me say the words restorative and justice in a sentence with sentence, he said, okay, off the record, come up here. And said, yeah, what? Explain this to me. This judge was rotating to another assignment. So the normal thing would have been after the 6-month period where he would have served all of his custody time and wouldn't have to actually physically go into state prison. The judge would have gone to another judge to actually impose the sentence. This judge said, I'm not going to do that because I want to see how this turns out.
Yeah. Wow.
And when it was a success story, I was really excited to see my judge praise him in front of the entire crowded courtroom and say that, and I did the same thing. And I never get to talk to the defendants because when they're represented by counsel, they have that protection.
Yeah.
I asked his lawyer, may I speak with your client? Would that be okay? And I asked him if I could shake his hand. And for once, we actually, in front of the courtroom, we got to and I asked him, how did it feel? I need to know because I want to try this again with other people that seem to be keyed up to succeed here like you did. How did it feel? And he shared with me how good it felt to have been given this opportunity and have been able to keep all the promises he made us. And one of the things that he learned was he was never part of a community before. And he was offered a youth ministry position and was going to go back and take it. With the youth outreach that we do in Richmond, I told him, obviously, if I stand in front of Richmond High School, they look at me and go, I don't look like the kids I'm talking to.
Yeah.
If you stood with me and said, don't follow my path because this is where I almost ended up, it would be different.
Yeah.
And he agreed that I could contact him the next time we were able to stand in front of a high school, and either I could use his essay or he would come with me and talk to those kids. And so I'm really excited about that as a success story.
Yeah.
Part of our outreach is not just teaching girls not to be victims. We don't want the young men to enter into the criminal justice system. Nichelle and I agree that if we could put ourselves out of business as sex trafficking prosecutors, nothing would make us happier.
Well, maybe the church can help with that a little bit.
Fantastic. We'll take all partners.
It's a deep question about the condition of the heart, I think, in some ways. And one of the things I love about the Bible is stories of redemption. The Bible has, if we approach especially the narratives in the Old Testament from the straightforward template, oh, these are all hero stories. Everybody in here is a moral exemplar. We're going to really get to some weird readings because the Bible has a very sophisticated character development over time. And so you see some people doing catastrophically dumb things. But the thing is that the biblical narrator is sophisticated enough not to tell us, dear reader, that was a major mistake. So, but what's beautiful is, like, for example, a guy named Judah in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 38. So anyways, Judah has 3 sons, and the first son marries a woman, and the first son dies. Then the second son marries that woman, and he dies too. And Judah says, I'm not giving my third son to this woman. And she says, I know what justice needs. You need to provide me a child. So she dresses up as a sex worker, and he sleeps with her, impregnates her. And then when he finds out that his ex-daughter-in-law is pregnant, he throws the book at her and says, that's wrong, you're going down. And she said, oh, by the way, I'm pregnant by the man who gave me these things. And he had given her like a certain seal. And so she totally like burns him. And he owns it. He says, you're more righteous than me. And he's like super embarrassed. And so that's Genesis chapter 38, which is artfully paralleled with Genesis 39, which is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife and the sort of the seduction there, and Joseph flees and leaves a jacket and everything. But the cool thing is that by the end of the story, Judah has developed into a different person. And Judah, actually, there's this dramatic scene in chapter 48 where Judah offers his life on behalf of his whole family. And it's a complex family situation. But I guess what I find beautiful is a narrative arc of redemption, and the fact that stupid things, wounding things, evil things, illegal things don't have to be the end of the story, which is not to say that there's not consequences and there's not accountability and there's not a firm justice, but that there can be this restorative dimension. And I find that just hopeful and beautiful. And
that's our goal. That's the goal of the task force, and that's the goal of the prosecutions in our unit for our victims. We're looking to make our victims whole, and we use statutory mechanisms for doing that. So California's Constitution has the Victims' Bill of Rights, which is Marcy's law. And there are a bunch of different statutes that protect the dignity of all people when they come to court as witnesses. And so Nichelle and I find ourselves fighting battles as champions for our victims so that they are treated with dignity and respect. And it takes a lot of trust building for them, because I'm a representative of the criminal justice system, and we've been kind of bashed in the last couple of years. And the belief that I value you as a human, and I'm going to, and regardless of what you might have done, with a lot of my plea negotiations, the defense starts off with, your victim has done all of these terrible things. All of my victims are people with vulnerabilities that have been exploited by your client. So my rejoinder is always, that's why your client chose her. Of course she is. And we have statutes now, California law, that lets us have an expert explain to a jury the impact of human trafficking on a survivor, and answers these questions that juries have in their heads. Why didn't she just leave? Or why did he let that happen? Or why did he agree to this? And we're explaining the dynamics, the impact, the power imbalance that occurs in these relationships. And so not unlike the biblical stories, you look at the laws of the time and how they can create situations ripe for exploitation. But when you change those laws, or you change that context, it can create an opportunity for redemption and healing.
So how would, if you're someone in our church, just a regular congregant, and you're listening to this and find it interesting and want to help in some way, but you're not aware of any immediate situation that you can, what are some avenues? Is there anything that we can do to contribute to this? Or
sure
just beyond praying for you and rooting you on from the sidelines?
Pray for all of us. Pray for our task force. January is actually National Human Trafficking Awareness Month.
Is it really?
It is, and so we're very busy with preparing for a bunch of outreach events to the extent that we can do them in
like
the pandemic. Yes, like this one. If you, there's a slide that hopefully can be thrown up there while we're talking about this. There is the Alliance to End Abuse. Their website will have all of the different events that are happening. January 11th is Wear Blue Day. This is my favorite Wear Blue suit. Oh. Blue is the human trafficking awareness color. And so we ask people to wear blue to show solidarity and support for victims of human trafficking. And so much of this exploitation occurs online and through social media. So we're using social media to show our solidarity. Wear blue. And the website gives you the hashtag that will let us show a national response for survivors of human trafficking, all forms of trafficking. So the congregation can do that, have a Wear Blue Day, take a big congregation photograph and post it on your social media with Wear Blue. Individuals can do that, kids can do that. Our Board of Supervisors will do a countywide proclamation recognizing Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So I know we can watch the Board of Supervisors meetings online now. I think I tried to give you the link for where to do that. There's all Board of Supervisors meetings have time for public comment. So before, when you went in person, you would fill out a comment card. Now you can do that virtually and let the Board of Supervisors know that you support anti-trafficking efforts and the Contra Costa's collaborative human trafficking task force. We need the support from our Board of Supervisors if we're going to survive and grow the way we want to in Contra Costa County. All of my victim advocacy partners are nonprofits. And they need financial support. And so our advocacy partners include the Family Justice Center, Community Violence Solutions. There are basically our 24-hour crisis line for all victims in Contra Costa of sexual violence. STAND is our domestic violence advocacy organization. And I told you a lot of our cases show up as domestic violence because the victims aren't in that place yet. or they can explain that the reason he hit me is I wouldn't go out and sell sex for him. So Stan's another great organization that needs our help. A newer organization that has just co-located with our East County Family Justice Center is Love Never Fails. They're doing a lot of outreach efforts for youth, and they're actually retraining people that have been engaged in commercial sex work so that they can make that clean break and start over with jobs in the IT sector. So it's and they have a shelter for youth also. The International Rescue Committee is the partner that we use for victims that are foreign born. Missy is another organization that has been really influential in Alameda County. They've just gotten a federal grant to expand into Contra Costa County, so they're working with our Family Justice Center in Richmond. If I'm forgetting anybody, I have everybody's email addresses on the slide.
we're gonna post your PowerPoint presentation so that everyone can access the information and links and so forth. And well, thank you so much. This has given me a ton to think about. And I'm really inspired by your work and find it really meaningful. And I'm glad to know people like you are doing work in our community. And so I just want to say, like, from one person and from a pastor at our church, thank you. And thank you for sharing your time with us. And we hope to help in some way, whether it's in a small way of putting on my blue sweater instead of my red one, or whether it's any more meaningful activity. I think the Bible compels us to not look the other way when we see this kind of stuff, when we're aware this is going on. So
I think we just need, as a community, to be that safe place for people that are struggling with having been engaged in commercial sex work, struggling with having promoted or profited from commercial sex work. And that's how we're going to really make an impact in ending trafficking and exploitation, is to just reach out to all of those individuals and keep their human dignity intact. Right.
And that's where, as a church, our basic premise, our basic mandate is to say, we're all in need of grace. There's nobody here that has the moral high ground. And so the sort of the premise of shaming is undercut at a fundamental level through our faith. So I hope that people would feel that we're a place that they can come to and that they can feel loved and seen and valued as human beings. So.
And especially with our kids, be that trusted adult. And talk to your kids about, if one of your friends comes to you, would you know what to say? Would you know what to do? And this is a community. This should be a community of trusted adults if our kids are struggling with that.
We've got a great youth ministry and wise youth leaders. And so that's, they're dealing with real stuff a lot. And so we're proud of them. And we'll just want to say thank you again. And the end. I don't know how to end interviews. I'll work on that.